Hello, and welcome to Stuart Saturday Live with me, your hostess, Andrea Zuvich, the 17th century lady. Last month, we welcomed Elizabeth St. John, a wonderful author of historical fiction set in the Stuart era. She and I discussed Stuart love stories, and she told us about her ancestral home at Lydiard House. If you missed it, you can head on over to my podcast, The 17th Century Lady, which you can find on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. Well, it is March already. Can you believe it? I'm finding it rather hard. Well, there's a lot going on this month. Earlier this week, I was a guest on the If It Ain't Baroque podcast, in which I discussed Catherine of Braganza's relationship with King Charles II. If you don't already follow that podcast, try it out. They have lots of interesting topics, which they discuss with many different historians. On March the 5th, just a few days away, a new drama called Mary and George, starring Julianne Moore, will be out on Stars. It's about George Villiers, who became the first Duke of Buckingham, his mother, played by Moore, and their ambitions and schemes to make him King James's favourite, with all the power, wealth, and prestige such a position would bring. I'm always a little wary about any production set in the 17th century, frankly, but I'm willing to give it a try. Now, later this month, we will be participating in the Stuart History Festival, which will run from Friday the 22nd to Sunday the 24th of March, 2024. So you'll have a whole weekend of Stuart history. Yay! Now, I would like to congratulate Nicola Cornick on her new historical fiction release called The Other Gwyn Girl, which is about Nell Gwyn's sister, Rose. We will be welcoming Nicola onto this show in June, so that's something to look forward to. Speaking of guests, the upcoming months are fast filling up with more amazing people who love the 17th century, including Deborah Swift, J.D. Davies, Gareth Russell, and more. So thank you to our audience members for your continued interest in this show. All right, well, without further ado, it's time for our Stuart Saturday chat. Now, I'm wearing something a bit different than usual because I'm going to talk to someone about a period that began in 1603, so earlier than what I usually do, and in a different place on the other side of the world. 1603 was a crucial year in the British Isles, for in March of that year, Elizabeth, the last Tudor monarch, died, leaving the throne to the King of Scots, James VI. And he became James I of England. 1603 was also a major year in the history of Japan, when, just as the Stuart family from Scotland began ruling over England, the Tokugawa family began ruling Japan with their shogunate. Today, we will be focusing on Edo, Japan, which spanned the years 1603 to 1868, with the help of our guest, who is the author of several history works, including Wild East, The British in Japan, 1854 to 1868, which is the story of the rocky beginning of Anglo-Japanese relations, a story of the Wild East, full of political schemes, gunboat diplomacy, assassins, and samurai, set in the dying days of the Edo period and the twilight of the last shogun. Joining us live from Newcastle, please welcome Joshua Provan. Hello, Josh. Welcome to the show.
Hello. It's a pleasure
Hi.
to be here, Your Ladyship.
Thank you, kind sir. Well, we've known each other for some years now, and you very kindly had me on your YouTube show a few years ago. And in that episode, we talked about all sorts of 17th century related topics, and I had so much fun. So I had to have you on my show, of course. Today, however,
it was a pleasure to have you on.
Thank you so much. Today, I'd like to mainly focus on the Edo period, please. It's a period I've never really covered before, and then we might dip into the Stuarts briefly if time permits. So, Edo, Japan is a really interesting period. There was kabuki theater, which is traditional Japanese theater, which incorporates, or was it Japanese dance, ornate costume, and drama. Um, the history of kabuki dates back to the early 1600s, if I'm correct. The period also has a wealth of poetry, such as haiku, that was really kicking off then, taking off then. And clothing was being developed, such as the further evolution of the kimono. I read that the obi, I think that's how you pronounce it, was incorporated into the kimono in the Edo period. But before I go any further, I apologize to our Japanese speakers in the audience for any mispronunciations. All right. The term Edo is the ancient name of the place that became Tokyo. Is that right?
Yes, it is.
Yeah. Oh.
It's much smaller than today's Tokyo, but it
Mm.
is. That's what it is. It was renamed Tokyo at the beginning of the Meiji era, when the emperor was restored to power after 1868, and
Oh.
up until that point, and starting in 1603, the period is technically also dated to the Battle of Sekigahara in 1600. Edo is the capital of the
Oh.
shogun. If I was to, I can break down some important parts for you if you want.
Oh, that would be great. Thank you.
Um, well, it's a remarkable period that lasts almost 300 years, and it's a grand time of stability and general unity, with the last serious rebellion occurring in the 17th century. And rebellions did not reoccur really until the political meltdown of the 1850s. It saw the flourishing of a wide array of Japanese culture and achievements that took on a particularly Japanese aspect, many of which are still with us today and which we closely associate with Japan. You also have the successful exclusion of foreign influence that allowed that to happen, in a time when few countries in the world escaped Euro-American conquest or colonization. It
Hmm.
was therefore realistically the birth of modern Japanese identity and remains one of the
I see.
strongest roots of Japanese heritage, as much of, like I say, what we know about Japan today and what Japanese popularly know about earlier periods was preserved and transmitted through this long period of peace. Um, there were 6 shoguns, I think, who ruled during the 17th century. 3 of them
Wow.
are amongst the greatest, considered amongst the greatest of the lot of the Tokugawa. And under their rule, most trade, foreign influence, and access to Japan was restricted by, I think, the 1630s, in a policy which, by the end of the period that I wrote about, was called
Mhm.
Sakoku, or the closed country. So by 1638, only the Dutch were actually allowed to reside in Japan as foreigners, European foreigners anyway. And
Oh, right.
they were also the only ones allowed to trade in Japan. And Christianity was prohibited, specifically Catholicism, and no Japanese subject was allowed to live for 5 years abroad without being permanently exiled. And after a certain point, it was potentially a death sentence to return after that time. So a lot of stuff happens in around 250, 260 years, rounded up to about 300. Some people round it up to 300.
I see. Wow. A very interesting and um, maybe a tumultuous period as well. Yeah. Um, Edo Japan was a strictly hierarchical culture, was it not? I mean, let's see if I have this right. You had the emperor at the top, right? And then that was under him would be the shogun and the daimyo, and
Yeah,
then
yeah,
the samurai,
yeah.
and then merchants and peasants. Is that correct?
Basically, yes, but there's some sort of nuances to it all.
Sure.
Um, you Yes, technically the class system was like stratas of rock, or at least that was the idea. There was not technically, you weren't technically allowed to transition from one to the other. However, there were ways of doing so that did happen. And we don't have time to go into all of that, but it could happen, but it wasn't officially something that was supposed to happen. It just sort of organically happened that way. So yes, you're correct. Technically, on paper, at the top you have the emperor,
Okay.
and then you had the warrior class called the bushi, and the principal fighters of the bushi were the samurai. And then, in political terms, you had artisans, peasants, and way down at the bottom you have merchants.
Oh,
Yes.
so wow. Okay, and why was that then? It doesn't see from where we are. It seems that the merchants would be a bit more elevated.
You see, they were as well. That's the confusing thing.
Okay.
In terms of status, merchants, though considered lower than artisans and working peasants because they worked for money rather than to create anything or to feed the country, they, in some cases, were obviously far richer than the daimyos. And so you have this strange thing where you have an entire class of people who are making all the money and but have no social standing, and a whole class of people who have all the social standing but are not making the same amount of money. And then you have the people in between. And this is something that very much typifies the Edo period, which is the rise of the merchant class due to, well, essentially, the Tokugawa don't have a particularly efficient tax system. So the merchants keep getting richer, and that allows them to expand and do things that traditionally they weren't supposed to do. Now, the emperor and the shogun, that's an important distinction to make here. It was tremendously confusing to Europeans when they came to Japan about who was actually in charge. They used to think, they used to think there were two emperors because of the way it was set up. And in a way, there sort of were. But realistically, you have the emperor, who is descended from an ancient line going back to the very founding of Japan. But since the end of the Genpei War in the 12th century, the emperor has had no real political power and has no place in the government of the running of Japan, essentially. He's involved in politics to some degree. Some of them were involved in politics to some degree, but they have no constitutional role, you might call it. And so that role, that head of state role that you'd think the emperor would hold, is actually held by this chap called the shogun. And a couple of imperial chancellors who bridged a certain gap during what they called the Sengoku Jedi, which is the Warring States period. And so, as an example, after the Battle of Sekigahara, 1600, Tokugawa Ieyasu is granted the role of shogun by the emperor. The emperor has no choice, really, but to give him this title because he wants it. But nevertheless, he bestows the power of shogun and the right to rule to him. That's where the shogun derives his power, his political authority, but the emperor just remains a semi-mystic figure, living in great splendor and mystery in his court in Kyoto. And so largely fulfilling ceremonial functions in support of the shogun's policies.
Wow. That's incredible. I can see why people were very confused about the whole thing. But this is part of the fascinating thing about learning about different cultures, that you can learn how they do things, and sometimes it makes sense upon further analysis. And I just love that. I mean, that's one of the reasons why I went to cultural anthropology in my undergrad days. What about this this period in time in Japanese history drew you to researching further?
It was sort of an accident. I was always aware of certain things, popular things about Japan. Being interested in military history, I knew what the samurai were and things like that.
Mm.
But it sort of started with a sort of the question: why? How did Japan avoid the fate of India and China? Japan obviously was a very powerful nation at the beginning of the 20th century. It was unified. It was modern. It had been accepted into the League of Nations, the only Asian power to do so. And so I wondered why. Next to that, and sort of as connected very closely to that, is what were the British doing in Japan at this time? Because, well, the British were making messes everywhere around the world, and taking little bits of land here and there, and starting little trade empires everywhere they went. And I wondered, well, surely they wanted a piece of Japan. So I asked those questions, and I started to get little answers, and I started learning about different people who visited Japan in the late Edo period, and it went on from there into the book. And I've always maintained a very close interest in the Edo period. Generally speaking, as whenever I can indulge in reading about it, I try to. Also, just the art and the general material culture is just very pleasing.
Oh yes, well, material culture. That brings me on to my next bit here. I'm sure you've had a look through the Metropolitan Museum of Art's images. They're wonderful things from all cultures around the world. It's wonderful. This right here is called Old Plum, and it's by the Japanese artist Sansetsu, excuse me, from 1646. And these were painted panels which originally formed one wall of a room in the Tenshuon. Is that correct?
Yes.
And
yes.
a sub-temple of the Myoshinji, a Zen temple in Kyoto, Japan. And so that brings me to my next question. What was the dominant religion or religions and philosophy in Japan at this time? Could you please enlighten us with that, please?
I can try. I mean to begin with, wall decorations and screens from palaces and temples are amongst some of the most impressive pieces of Japanese art that you can see, just because of their scale. And I agree, these are amazing.
They're beautiful. Yes.
I wish my room had walls like that. Anyway, of interest, actually, speaking of uniquely Japanese art as well, before I talk about religion and philosophy, is that
Sure.
the ornate screens that represent the landscape, and this was developed in one of the great cultural exchanges with Tang China in the Heian period. But the Japanese leisure nobility, you might call it, improved on it until it reaches the high form that you see there. And by the time of the Edo period, it represented sort of the classical ideal of Japanese art, and it's called Yamato-e, and it's characterized by very careful, accurate scenes and figures that sort of blend into very complicated and vast scenes. But they also tended to reflect nature and be very, again, complicated, simple, sort of superficially simple compositions that, like the plum tree, which say something else as well. And actually, we'll talk about this a little later, but Yamato-e is, because it's so old, it influences to some degree another artistic movement that comes later, and which is called ukiyo-e. and those are the prints that everybody will know about. Ukiyo-e is the Japanese art that everybody knows about. But you can see the influences of Yamato-e in anytime you see sort of like floating clouds that obscure part of the picture, and
Right.
scenes of nature, and scenes where crowds of people are set against big cities or monumental landscapes. That's a rabbit hole, and I'm very sorry about that. But
It's
moving
fine.
on to actual Edo stuff. Um,
I love it. That's great.
okay. So, right, religion. Generally speaking, Japan had embraced two major religions since perhaps before there ever was a place called Japan. The oldest religion is Shinto, which is essentially a. It's very difficult to explain. Even scholars have difficulty actually explaining, like putting in this. But generally speaking, it is an acknowledgement of the divine, and this is an acknowledgement of the divine through nature, through what is around us.
Right.
Irreverence of the kami, the gods that live in the wind, sky, water, forests, things like that. It doesn't really have scriptures, doesn't have great amounts of ancient writing, even though it's older than a lot of things in the Edo period. It's older than all of the Edo period, but there is
Wow.
Shinto, and it's nevertheless tied together by a priesthood and rituals and observances at certain times of the year to connect with the kami and to keep things in balance, because the kami are mercurial. Some of them are friendly, some of them are not so friendly, etc. Things like that.
I see.
Again, very difficult to explain. The other
But
one,
thank you. Thank you.
I've tried. I do my best, but there's proper scholarship on defining it, and it's something you experience and study rather than really just explain.
Yeah,
But
but that's
it's
great that now people know that one of the religions was Shinto. Yes,
yes,
that's great.
Shinto is one of them. The other one, which is very popular by the time of the Edo period, is Buddhism, and
Mm.
this came over from either China or Korea, obviously up from India, in I think it was around the 6th century or something like that. And by the time of the Genpei War, which I mentioned earlier,
Mm-hmm.
uh, you have it has transformed into what the Japanese call Zen,
I see.
and that is a Japanese version of a Tang Dynasty Chinese adaptation of one of the main Buddhist meditation disciplines. And so these two are considered sort of the two pillars of faith in Japan at the second. You also have, philosophically speaking and classically speaking, Confucian and Taoist teachings from China, and they melded quite well into Japanese Shinto and Zen practices. And to that extent, they become very influential without overcoming either of the two main religions. Japanese kind of are considered more spiritual than religious in some
Mm-hmm.
circles,
Right.
and many even today actually reject the idea of being part of an organizational religion unless they're a priest,
Oh, okay.
but still have a belief in something. And
So
well,
all
yeah.
these were quite harmonious together. They work. They
Well,
in some
yes.
more or less, but not like
I mean,
quite a dominant one would come in. It's not like that, and
yeah. Generally speaking, yes, they got along to some extent
reasonably well.
because
Okay.
yes, because Zen is about meditation and Shinto is about the observance of the divine in nature. So the two come together quite well. They're not too harsh. They're not too harshly butting against each other. Taoism as well is also fairly practical sort of philosophy that blended quite well into various forms of this. Politics, there were politics involved because you do have religious hierarchy in Japanese history. You do have powerful sort of you do have powerful organizations that rise within the two, and you have but that really was part of the plan, to be honest. The shoguns have this pretty clever idea, to be honest. The Tokugawa shoguns, are all about unity and stability, central power, things like that. That's why they come up with most of all of their rules, including, I think it says Sanken Kotai, which is the alternate the hostage system, for want of a better word, where families live in Edo and the daimyos live elsewhere, and then they come visit every year. And for the good behavior of the daimyos, the families are sort of held in the capital. But you also, yes, you also,
I did read about this, and they were treated pretty well, though, the families.
Oh yes. It's not like unless of course the daimyo misbehaved, then there are consequences. But generally speaking, it's just you live here. This is where you live, and you go to work somewhere else for the rest half of the year, and then you come and you do your bit of loyalty to the shogun.
I see.
But in the same sort of sense, the Tokugawa shoguns liked the idea of having a sort of plurality of the main religions, so that one could sort of counteract the other, and that one did not gain so much political power that they became a threat to the shogun's government, called the Bakufu. And that's why even Christianity was at first entertained by certain lords, because some of them felt that, say, the Buddhists were getting a little too powerful. So if we counteract that with the Christians, also the Christians have these cool ships and muskets, maybe that will help out. And it didn't turn out so well for Catholic Christianity, because they started to fear that it was just too foreign and too much of a way for foreigners to get influence in Japan, which was why they started to try then and suppress it. Also of mention is, of course, the last totemic religion in Japan during the Edo period, which is practiced and at that time was still yet to be totally suppressed amongst the Ainu people of Hokkaido in the north, who had yet to be totally assimilated into the wider mainstream Japanese culture. They'd actually rebel against the shogun in 1669 in an attempt to maintain their independence. There is an exhibition on Ainu culture in London somewhere at the second, actually, which people can check out.
Oh, well, that's really good. Do you know where that is?
I think it's at Japan House in Kensington, if I remember the email details.
Right. Oh, that's very interesting. So for those who are able to commute or live in the London area, you can go and visit that exhibition. That sounds amazing. Great. Thank you so much. I've learned a lot just by that. Thank you. May we talk about the literature of or inspired by the Edo period for a bit, as there were some wonderful works that were made at that time, including poetry from the likes of Basho, who lived from 1644 to 1694, and is considered one of the greatest haiku poets. There were also novels, plays, poetry, you name it. Do you have any favorites from this time?
Well, Basho is one of my favorites. He's wonderful. And haikus are really fun. I've even tried writing a few myself, every now and again. And Basho's Frog in a Pond is actually the first one. It's one of his most famous ones. It's also the first one that allowed me to understand what they do. And then others like Now Then, Let's Go Out to Enjoy the Snow Until I Slip and Fall.
Wow.
That was written in 1688, and
Well, that's perfect for us, right?
yes, indeed, yes. Lots of his best stuff is written in the 17th century, and right in your favorite part of the 17th century. He's got another one which is quite famous, which is about cicadas, but I can't really do it justice, to be honest. But look up Basho and cicadas, and you'll see what I mean.
Okay, we'll do that.
Yes, that's a strange request, but yeah. As for other literature and novels, it's a weird thing actually. Ever since I've started writing history books, I've had so little time even to read English novels that I'm becoming afraid that I'm actually losing the skill to read books cover to cover rather than just dipping into.
Oh, that is a problem that we face, isn't it? Because it's a time-consuming thing to read everything. But when you're working on a project, you have to just dip in. That's all you have time for. And unfortunately, we don't have an unlimited amount of time for leisure reading. Well, at least we don't. I don't think.
Yeah, so I don't have a great grasp on the literature except for some haikus. Obviously, there are. I actually did buy a book recently by Shisaku Endo called The Samurai, which I started, and that's turning out pretty well.
Well, that's good because I read his other work, which is Silence, and have you read that at all?
I haven't read that one. I've just seen the movie.
Okay. Yeah. Well. Yeah. So the book was, in my opinion, quite bleak and desperately sad, but I think overall it was a good and moving read. But it's quite rough on the emotions.
Yes.
For those unacquainted with the novel that we're discussing right now, it was written in 1966 by a Japanese author. Can you say his name again, please?
Shisaku Endo.
That's it. Yes, and it's about European Jesuit Christian missionaries, priests who went to Japan in the 17th century, and it details their struggles and hardships there. And as Josh said, it was made into a film in 2016, and that was starring Andrew Garfield, Adam Driver, Tadanobu Asano, Kieran Hines, and Liam Neeson. So yeah, what did you think about the film, Josh?
It's very well done. It's got a lot of powerful performances in it.
Yes, it sure does.
I think that it's probably because there's been a couple of adaptations of Silence into films, and partly I think it's because of the conversation that it tries to have. Shisaku Endo was actually a Christian, and so a lot of his best known novels are ones where he tries to explore the divide or the relationship between his faith and his country, because as I said before, Japan from 1630 specifically, under the third Tokugawa shogun, seriously suppressed Christianity. Missionaries, like in Silence, they hide them for a reason. They are absolutely not allowed to be there. And because only, as I said before as well, only the Dutch are allowed to be there. And rather amusingly, the Dutch are allowed to be there and still have you can still worship privately as Protestants, because they didn't associate Protestantism and Catholicism as the same thing.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, because Christians were Catholics to them, so whatever the Protestants were didn't particularly register as the same problematic thing as the Spanish and the Portuguese, as the baggage the Spanish and the Portuguese had brought along with them. So that was how they sidestepped that. No, it's a very interesting movie. It's very thought provoking. As a Christian myself, it raises the question: and if you were them, what would you do? I'm not sure there's an answer to that.
No, it's quite brutal, the whole thing. So
yeah, and
it does raise questions.
Yeah, I've seen a couple of interesting YouTube videos from Catholic priests about it, and their perspective is rather interesting as well. One, they seem to say that while it's very interesting, and they couldn't necessarily blame anybody for taking the decision that the priests take, no spoilers, but there is a betrayal here, and not just in terms of religion. But you have to read the book and see the movie if you have the fortitude.
Yes, yeah, it's you definitely have to go in knowing that it's going to be a hard one. Yeah. Wow. Gosh. Yep. Well, moving on. When I was an undergraduate at university, I took some courses on East Asian history, and one of the books I came across was Koshoku Gonen Onna, or 5 Women Who Loved Love. And that was published in 1686. So again, right in my favorite time period. And it was written by Ihara Saikaku, who was an author from Osaka, Japan. This book is a collection of 5 stories about 5 different love stories, really, and the amorous experience of those characters. It is considered one of the masterpieces of literature from 17th century Japan, particularly from the Edo era, often referred to as the Genroku. I don't know. Can you say did I pronounce that correctly?
That is an excellent question. Where is the G hard? I had never thought about that before. It could be Genroku.
How would you pronounce
I suppose my natural inclination is to say Genroku, but
yes,
it could be Genroku. I don't know.
I'm not sure. Right. And so that was a period of Japanese cultural history from circa 1675 to 1725. Have you read it? If not, are there any works translated into English from the Edo period that you would recommend? Maybe it's just the bestseller, really.
Yeah, again, and sadly, I haven't. But I haven't read it. I do know of Saikaku because I have read certain books of history about the literature of Japan. So I know that he's quite notable because he wrote what today we recognize as a prose novel, essentially, rather than a work of autobiography, poetry, history, philosophy, some sort of meditation on a particular subject.
I thought it was quite beautiful. Of course, I only read the translation, but that came across quite as a beautiful work. So
yeah, I mean, it's what's interesting about Saikaku and the writers of this particular period is that it's sort of it can help you get into the idea of what's special culturally about the Edo period, and a little about what I was talking about at the beginning, in fact, as well. So, for instance, at the beginning, I talked about Yamato-e and sort of high art, which was supposed to be reserved for the nobility. And you had those works like that list of topics I just reamed off there, which it would be considered, in quotes, Chinese learning or works by Chinese writers. That doesn't mean they're Chinese. That means that it is in the style of Chinese learning. So
Right.
considered like the English would consider French literature. And what happens in the Edo period is that because the merchant class is on the rise, you get a whole flowering of literature and art that is made by and for the merchant class.
Okay.
Saikaku writes about, relationships and love and comedy,
Yes.
and it was considered fairly lowbrow at that time. It was considered scandalous in some circles because it's somewhat ribald and
Yes, it is.
so that is part of what they called yukio,
Mhm.
floating world, and that is one of the main movements of art in Edo, Japan. It's yukio means floating world, a transitory. It was meant to be a sort of a melancholy Buddhist Zen concept, which was supposed to convey the transitory nature of life,
Okay.
like the sakura, like
Mhm.
like a cicada, and things come to life, they bloom and they pass away, and that's why they're beautiful. Um, but because of this sudden boom in the merchant and working class, and they needed a place to go to have fun, to hang out, to have leisure time, and they were excluded from upper society to do these things. They went to the pleasure quarters to do them.
Mhm.
And that is where you get that is why it is slightly mockingly attributed to what goes on in the pleasure quarters of Edo, called the Yoshiwara.
Right.
Uh, and so they called that the floating world, the people of the floating world, the pictures of the floating world,
I
ukiyo-e.
see.
And
Mhm.
so it's a slightly humorous mockery of the merchant class, which lives this sort of like pleasurable life and then goes about their business and has their fun and doesn't really do anything particularly. However, it births most of what we consider traditional, just pure Japanese art forms. Like what I'm wearing today, I'm literally wearing one. This is the Great Wave of Kanagawa, right? By Hokusai.
Oh, wow.
That is a ukiyo-e woodblock print. And
Right. Could you move it down a
see,
bit? Oh, yes. Very nice.
uh, so it's a fascinating. So Saikaku, when he was writing these things, and even haiku is the same.
Mhm.
That was written majority for merchant class people coming from the original very short presae that would go before a much longer poem, and they just cut it off and said, what if I explain everything I want to say in these 3 lines? This is what we're dealing with. It's avant-garde.
Yeah, it's concise.
Yes, it's new, it's completely different, but at the same time distinctly Japanese, because it happens in this bubble of the Edo period of basically purely Japanese invention. And so that is why writing like Daikaku and Basho and the ukiyo-e is, and and paintings like this are special because they happened within what they called the Great Peace. They didn't call it the Edo period at the time; they called it the Great Peace.
Oh,
Um, which, I mean, that if you, which is confusing because you talked about Gen/Genroku. That is, I'm having flashbacks to when I wrote the book now, which is a little PTSD there. Within each large period,
mhm.
there is era names,
There it is. Mhm.
and that is an era name. Unlike names like the Edo period, which would not have been
Mhm.
recognized particularly in contemporary Japan of the time. They called it the Great Peace, etc. They did recognize era names, which tended to coincide with the deaths of shoguns, the ascension of shoguns, the deaths of state ministers, natural disasters, foreign affairs, stuff like that. They sort of, you reach a sort of like a high. It's sort of like a hmm, syllable. It's like a syllable on a
Oh.
calendar,
Oh, okay.
and then you mark that passage with the name, and then that becomes what that was, the era of Ansai, the era of Genroku, the etc. And
Right.
that's anyway. Saikaku was really good at getting back on track. He was really good at doing good popular fiction, good popular
I see.
stories. People enjoyed them. He could cross a line sometimes. The government licensed three big pleasure quarters in Kyoto, Osaka, and Edo, but they didn't necessarily want to encourage hedonism. It wasn't exactly good Zen practice
Right.
to
I
like
understand.
say,
Yes.
So they actually did censure him a couple of times, I believe. But
Right.
that's the interesting balance of this sort of literary era.
Right. Well, thank you so much. I just realized that earlier when we were talking about films, I didn't mention something, and I'm going to get in so much trouble with a certain little 7-year-old. Um, my daughter asked me to mention one film, which she loves from the 17th century, and that is Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, the third.
Okay, yeah,
So yes, that was fun.
uh-huh.
Um, I was born in the 80s, so the Ninja Turtles were quite huge then. And oddly enough, I never realized that they'd set a film at that time. But Juliet, you've got it was
Got
mentioned.
it in. You got it in.
I got it in. Um,
The
you referred earlier. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Well, as a nugget for you,
Uh-huh.
the Japanese of the Edo period and to this day had a great love of small animals, a very great interest in insects and invertebrates and things like
Oh,
that. So it's actually kind of fitting that you would have a bunch of animated turtles running around doing stuff in the Edo period. That would be very, I think a lot of haiku poets would find that hilarious, and a lot of writers would find that hilarious. If you Google it, I don't know what collection it's in, but you can find little figures called Netsuke, and they're
oh yes.
tiny little sculptures that you'd use
Yeah.
to hang on little ropes that you would wear, little ties, little
Yeah.
things around.
Yes, I
And
know people who collect them. Yeah,
exactly,
they're
yes,
tiny. Yeah, they're very
and
cute.
they are exactly, and there are some of them are of turtles. So look them up.
Oh, that's perfect. Yes. So any turtle fans, you know what to do next. Um, so Japan is very well known for cherry blossom time or sakura, in which all the cherry trees are in full bloom, and this is a big part of their culture, isn't it? Um,
Yeah,
I've read that cherry blossom watching was a popular pastime back in the 17th century, and oh yeah, here we have an image taken by my husband Gavin on one of his visits to Japan in the early 2000s. And I'm really glad he was able to have a first-hand look at this beautiful tradition, which continues to this day. I love that. I love when countries have this continuity of something cultural and beautiful. I love it. Um, so,
yes, it is amazing. It's lovely. You can get a little sense of it in Britain as well, to some degree. When you at this time of year, this is sakura season. This is the
yes,
beginning of it. They
yes,
will
we
have
have a
it on.
cherry tree in the backyard.
Excellent. They will have in Japan right now. They will be starting the television forecasts as the
Mhm.
sakura moves up the country, so people can plan when to go and see it. It's called
Wonderful.
hanami, to go and view the sakura. Um, it's going out specifically out to have picnics and enjoy basking in it, basically around it, under it, as it grows around you, and as it sort of as the wind blows it down on top of you and things like that, and you go and contemplate it and have a good time. This was a very Edo period thing to do, even though in previous times it had been the reserve of the nobility, people who have the free time to do this. But again,
Yes.
Edo period is a populist time. The merchant class and the working class as well. Population expands, wealth increases, so people have more time, and the merchant class get in on the act. And Edo, the city itself, starts to get famous spots where you can go and view the sakura, and you can do it in the autumn as well. There's another one. It's called Momijigari, which is you go to view the autumn color in the hills.
Oh, I didn't know that. That's lovely.
And even before sakura became the thing to do, it was plum blossom viewing. But by the Edo period, it was absolutely sakura, and you can see why. It's an amazing plant, and it's a wonderful pastime that.
Yeah, certainly is.
If I knew of a park that was just covered in it, I would go and sit out in it.
Oh, yes. And I think they have picnics and all sorts.
Yes.
Yeah, wonderful. In your book, you wrote about the late Edo period, as it was in decline. Of course, all civilizations are created, rise, fall, and we see that throughout history all over the world. But in the particular case of the Edo, what were the factors, in your opinion, which led to its downfall?
Well, you have a boom in publishing around the mid-19th century, or at the beginning of it probably too, and that allowed critics of the Bakufu, the shogun's government, a platform to state their case, because not everybody had gotten on board with how the shogun came to power and why the shogun was in power rather than the emperor, or anyone else for that matter. But there was also a relaxation of what they called Dutch learning. So this is European studies brought in through the island of Deshima in the Bay of Nagasaki, which was the place where the Dutch were allowed to live. And so that brought a focus on the advancement of the West and the worrying degradation of China during the Opium Wars, which was of great concern to Japan. You also have, like I say, you have a large population boom, and that creates, we've talked a lot about the merchant class, but the old samurai class, the bushi class, warrior class, they also expand, but they don't have a lot to do because it's called the Great Peace, and they're the warrior class. So they become administrators and clerks and various other things, yeoman farmers essentially and whatnot. And so you have a well-educated but disillusioned and increasingly obsolete class of people. And so that's a problem too. They don't quite know what to. They're looking for some new purpose in all of this because it's the time of the merchants, and they're not quite happy about that.
Right.
You also have the fact that by the 1850s, the shogun is he's no longer really the leading figure in his own government. He's becoming very much more like the emperor in Kyoto, actually, with his council of elders, the Roju, increasingly taking the reins of power. And all of these things come crashing together when the answers needed to be found regarding the coercive opening of Japan to foreign trade between 1853 and 1858, which accelerated the pace of political change in Japan by just an unmanageable margin. And over the next decade, this led to such a polarization of the political spectrum into various parties of the Bakufu and imperial factions that they finally split into civil war in 1868, which led to the restoration of the emperor Mutsuhito, otherwise known as Meiji, as the head of state, whose descendants reign to this day. So a lot of factors sort of collided that couldn't be controlled, and there was no powerful leadership within the shogun's government until it was too late.
I see. Well, thank you. That's really an incredible time period, and thank you for explaining it so thoroughly for us. We only have a few minutes left, unfortunately, so let's head on back to the Stuart period now. And I'll just ask, dream dinner party, which people from the 17th century, from anywhere in the world, would you invite and why? Okay, let's narrow that down to 3. Yeah.
Okay. well, I can. We don't. This. I. Whenever I get asked this question, I tend to try and mix it up a little because
Okay.
you don't have the same people around every night.
No, of course. Yeah.
So this time around, why don't I invite some of the women of the 17th century
All
because
right.
I am I think most of us are woefully uneducated about women and female figures in the 17th century in general.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so I thought, what better way to get to know them than to talk to them? And they can bring their husbands if they want. I'm a generous host. The more the merrier. So I thought, and most of these will be quite like out of left field, right field, whatever field you want to go, but they're not going to be mainstream necessarily. So I thought Mariam Samani, otherwise known as Jodabai, who was one of the favorite
Mm-hmm.
wives of the Emperor Akbar. And
Wow.
then from Japan, Ogimachi Machiko, who wrote a famous diary, which I think has actually been recently translated. And she lived in the Edo period. I think it's
Oh.
called A Diary in the Shade of a Pine Tree. I think it's called 2021 that was published. Lady Kasuga, who was a prominent figure in Japanese politics and in the oku, or women's quarters of the shogun's court.
Mm-hmm.
And actually, this is not necessarily a plug, although it kind of is. If you go to my channel, you will find a video where I talk to the author Leslie Downer about women in Japan. So do please
Oh,
check that.
that's great. Yeah. Thank you for letting us know.
Yes, I really enjoyed that talk, and it's very, very interesting, and you'll learn a lot. So there's 3. I thought maybe, Pocahontas, her real name was Mataoka,
Mm-hmm.
and then maybe Moliere's wife, Armande Béjart. Maybe Barbara Villiers will come along as well.
Oh, well, she'll just steal the spotlight. Unfortunately, that was her way. Oh, well, thank you, Josh. That was a pleasure. I loved having you as a guest today. So to our audience, if you're intrigued, you can follow Josh on X, Facebook, and subscribe to his YouTube channel, Adventures in Historyland. I'll be sharing these links later today, and they're also under this on YouTube. Well, thank you so much, Josh. And thank you to our audience. That wraps up another edition of Stuart Saturday, and I hope you all have a lovely March. Until next time, keep it Stuart.